Can the Federal Reserve go bankrupt? Now, this question might seem a little bit preposterous at first glance because they can literally print money, but when you take a look at where they actually fund their operating expenses from, it comes from the profits of the assets held on their balance sheet. So what happens when, not if, but when they get to the point where their assets on their balance sheet are unprofitable to the point of causing total losses from them because of their own monetary policy? That's a question we're going to answer in this video, and we're going to look at what effects it might have on the economy as well. Ready? Let's dive in. Real quick, a word from today's sponsor, Swan Bitcoin. I use Swan Bitcoin to buy Bitcoin every single day. I dollar cost average, I stack sats. That means that as the price of Bitcoin is volatile and moving downwards, I'm getting my total overall position at a lower cost. I'm averaging down into it. The reason I use Swan Bitcoin is because we're looking around today, we're watching crypto exchanges lay people off. They're falling over like flies because they've all been not conservative. They've taken out leverage, but not so with Swan Bitcoin. They're extremely conservative, so I know that it's safe to use them. Because they only focus on Bitcoin, they're very efficient, very cheap, and the best part is they're extremely safe because your Bitcoin doesn't stay with them. You auto withdraw to a wallet of your choice whenever you want, and that's why I use Swan Bitcoin. And if you use my link in the description below, you will get $15 worth of Bitcoin just for signing up. Okay, so we have to take a look at this from a little bit of a historical perspective to understand what's going on with the overall banking system here. So first we have the original bank here. And when I say the original bank, this is a caricature of history that we're going to look at in order to understand how the system works, not because this is an exact scientific chronological study of what actually happened in history. This is a caricature. Okay, so we've got the original bank, and this original bank gets 10 pieces of gold from the economy. They say, hey, all you economic actors, give me your gold and I will keep it safe for you. So all the people say, sure, yeah, absolutely, that sounds great. And so they give those 10 pieces of gold. Initially, what this bank does is they just hold them safe, and in place of the 10 pieces of gold, they give 10 pieces of paper back to the people. And they say, hey, you can come give us that piece of paper at any time. We will go give you back your gold for that paper. At this point, no inflation has taken place, no fraud has taken place, no deflation has taken place. The exact same system as before, where you just had the 10 gold pieces circulating in the economy as money. Now you have 10 pieces of paper in their place. Very soon, though, the bank looks at this and says, hey, we've got an opportunity to make a profit here. So instead of just sticking to lending out the 10 pieces of paper, they change that number to 11 pieces of paper. So they say, hey, anybody want a loan? Come in here and we'll give you a loan, and we'll give you a loan at a really good rate, and you just have to pay us back at a certain time. And so now inflation has taken place. There are 11 pieces of paper circulating because when they give the loan, they give them a piece of paper. And so now there are 11 pieces of paper circulating in the economy. That's more money chasing the same number of goods and services. That starts to push prices higher. People feel wealthier. Business activity increases. You start to have investments being made based off of assumptions of prices continuing to go up. But eventually that debt has to get repaid. And when it gets repaid, then the prices go back down. So this is called fractional reserve banking, FRB. Fractional reserve banking. And fractional reserve banking results in temporary inflation and then deflation to compensate. The inflation happens when the extra money, there's 11 pieces of paper circulating in the economy, when that inflation takes place as a result of the money supply expanding on the back of a fractional reserve gold in the system. And then it deflates, the prices go back down when that debt is repaid and the money supply returns to what it was before. And so fractional reserve banking systems are temporarily inflationary. When the money is lent into existence, prices go up. When that debt is paid off, prices go back down. Now, obviously, this resulted in a lot of banking panics at first. When you had a bank that had 10 pieces of gold, what they would do is they would not just lend out 11 pieces of paper, they would lend out like 100 pieces of paper. And then prices would go up so much that eventually people would realize, hey, I don't think there's actually 100 pieces of gold in storage. So all the people would line up at the bank to try and redeem redeem their paper for gold. And lo and behold, there is not enough gold there. There's only 10 where people thought there were 100. And so this bank gets shut down. So that is a bank run. Now, what they did in order to prevent this from happening was they created a bank on top of all the banks called a central bank. Now, this is the big daddy bank. And so all they do is they coordinate transferring assets from one bank to another, and they hold them themselves. And so if there was a bank run over here because this bank didn't have enough gold, well, the central bank up here, they would take gold from a different bank and give it to this bank so that you could no longer be at risk of a bank run. And then all the people over here would be happy because they'd say, oh, well, I guess there is enough gold. I can get all my gold. And so you eliminated bank runs. And if you take a look at history, that is technically what happened. You eliminated the problem of bank runs in the economy because there was no more possibility for any single bank failure. What do I always say about risk, though? You can't eliminate risk, you can only transfer it. And when you transfer risk, when you eliminate the risk of individual failure, like those individual banks, you just transfer that risk to the entire system. And so in 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, fast forward to 1920, and you have the start of the first Great Depression because of the massive expansion of the money supply that happened during this period of time. The money supply grew very rapidly, and you caused a depression to happen. It was a nationwide inflation, then deflation, depression, crash. And then they didn't learn from their mistakes, and you fast forward again another 9 years from there, and you get the same exact thing happen. Credit expansion, artificial expansion of the money supply happened there. Money supply expanded rapidly, and you have the second Great Depression happen in 1929. So you can't eliminate risk, you can only transfer it. So the creation of the Federal Reserve centralized the risk, eliminated risk of individual failure. All the banks transferred it up to the entire system. Okay, so now we understand what the Federal Reserve does. The Federal Reserve is the big bank that just acts as the bank for all the banks that are underneath it, right? Okay, but it still operates the exact same way. It has some assets on its balance sheet, and it lends out paper that are allegedly redeemable for those assets, right? Basically, because of historical momentum and laws, it operates basically the same way today, even though they don't actually have any dollars that are redeemable for gold today. So that's the first thing that we have to understand about the Federal Reserve. The second thing that we have to understand about the Federal Reserve is that there was a lot of fear when the Fed was created that it would become a tool to monetize government spending. So now let's go to the government. If we look at the US government, they can spend in two ways. There's only two ways that they can get money to spend: taxes and borrowing. Those are the only two ways that the US government can spend money, is if they first bring in income from taxes or if they bring in money from borrowing. Both of these are transfer spending, because if they tax you from your paycheck and then spend it on healthcare spending, they're transferring money from you to healthcare. Every single dollar that the federal government spends that it brought in from taxes is a wealth transfer. It's the exact same thing about borrowing. It's just that borrowing is voluntary, whereas taxes are not. And so when you lend money to the government, that's the same thing as you buying a treasury. There's different words for the same thing. When you lend money to the government, you're choosing to postpone your purchasing power with that money, let the government have it for now, and then at some point that money will be transferred back to you. So transferred from you to the government to somebody else, wherever they spend that money, and then at some point in the future, government transfers money back to you from another place, sometimes taxes and sometimes borrowing. Now, you get to a point where the government runs out of money to borrow. One of the recent examples of this was in September of 2019. The United States government ran out of money to borrow. The economy just didn't have any money to lend to the United States government. This is where you get a merger between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Now, these are fancy words. Monetary policy is just what the Fed does, and then fiscal policy is what the US government does. And so monetary policy is like raising interest rates, buying assets, things like that. Fiscal policy is what the government does when they tax or spend, borrow or spend. Okay, so monetary policy, fiscal policy, Federal Reserve, federal government, separate things, but now they are much more tied together. Why is that? Because the Federal Reserve has jumped over loopholes in order to monetize government debt. So we know that banks, the way that they operate, like we said before, is they hold assets on their balance sheet and they lend out paper to people that could be redeemed for those assets. Well, today, a lot of those assets that they hold on their balance sheet, it's not gold, it is U.S. government debt. So that means they take deposits and then they lend those deposits to the United States government. And so the bank has a liability on one side, the dollar that they owe you back for your deposit. They also have an asset on the other side, which is the government owes them money. Now, it gets to a point, though, where the U.S. government wants to borrow more than the banks can lend to the government. And that is where the big daddy central bank, the Fed, comes in. The Fed comes in and they buy up U.S. government debt off of the open market. Now, debt is an instrument that can be traded back and forth. So if I owe you $100, you can wait for me to pay you back that $100, or you can sell that debt to somebody else. Somebody else might look at that and say, well, I'll give you $99 for that debt, just for the, I'll buy it from you for $99. And so you say, okay, so you get your $99 today instead of waiting for me to give you $100 in the future. And now I owe that $100 to that person who bought that debt from you. Same thing happens in the open economy in the market with United States Treasury debt. The United States Treasury will borrow money from the economy, from whoever wants to lend it money. And then those people, whoever make those loans, they can sell those loans to each other. Usually banks do this all the time. Financial institutions, large corporations, they hold a lot of treasuries, buy and sell them. Central banks all around the world do this. And so it's a very liquid market and they can buy and sell them. Now, when the federal government says, okay, well, we want to borrow more at whatever interest rate, treasuries are currently at 3%. So the government steps in and says, hey, we want to borrow a lot more right now, but we don't want to pay more than 3%. That is where the Federal Reserve comes in and they say, okay, well, U.S. government, we will step in and we will lend to you. So we'll create new dollars to lend to you. The problem is, that's illegal. They can't do that. So what do? We've got the Fed over here who prints dollars. And then they give those dollars to a regular old bank who holds the U.S. government debt. And then the bank gets those dollars instead of the debt. So that debt goes over to the Fed and those dollars go to that bank. Now that bank has just dollars instead of debt. And then what do they do with that? They turn around and they buy new debt from the U.S. government. So the banking system is just the middleman for debt monetization between the Federal Reserve and the United States government. If you follow this dollar that the Fed created went to this bank, and then that dollar went to the U.S. government. The U.S. government created new debt. They borrowed money from this bank, who then sold that debt to the Federal Reserve. So really, the Federal Reserve is lending new dollars to the federal government through the banking system. They just can't do it directly because of laws. This is like holding up the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. So they are monetizing the government's debt. They're just not doing it outright. Now, the question is coming full circle here because the video started off with the question of, can the Federal Reserve go bankrupt? Well, how in the world would they do that? The Federal Reserve, remember we were talking before about, this illustration, the banks, they hold assets on their balance sheet, right? Well, the Federal Reserve also holds assets on its balance sheet right now, not gold, but it holds, maybe it might have a little bit of gold. I say might because the number is disputed. They say they got a lot of gold, but they probably do not. So the Federal Reserve right now, if you look at their balance sheet, it looks something like this. Like that. And so this spike right here was from 2020 when they bought a bunch of U.S. government debt. This spike was from the Great Financial Crisis. And when it goes down, that's when they tried to do quantitative tightening and sell assets off their balance sheet, which they're trying to do right now. Ultimately, it always results in failure. So this is their balance sheet. And again, a balance sheet contains assets. And so this is made up of two things. One, U.S. government debt and mortgage-backed securities. So when you pay interest on your mortgage, chances are that that mortgage is held in a mortgage-backed security, and the interest from that goes and produces profits for the Federal Reserve. When the United States government has how much debt? $30 trillion of debt. Now, a lot of that is held on this balance sheet because there's $9 trillion almost of assets on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And so a lot of this $30 trillion of debt that the government has is going to print more and more profits for the Federal Reserve every time the federal government pays interest on the debt that's held at the Federal Reserve. Again, that's more profits for the Fed. So you might be looking at this and thinking, okay, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has $9 trillion of assets that are all producing profits for them. What do they do with all those profits? Well, this is where the fun comes in. This is the merger of monetary and fiscal policy that I was talking about earlier. We've got the Fed over here with their profits. And we've got the U.S. government over here that's paying a lot of those profits. The Federal Reserve, what they will do is they will subtract their expenses, and then whatever's left over will get sent right back over to the United States government. That's right. The Federal Reserve, they pay for their expenses and then send all the profits right back over to the government. What that means is that this giant balance sheet that the Federal Reserve has right now, all it's doing is covering their expenses. All the profits from that, whether it's mortgage-backed securities or treasuries, goes to the good old U.S. government. Okay, so it all goes to the U.S. government there. That's where all the profits go. So the question is, what happens if this balance sheet that I keep on drawing over and over again, what happens if that balance sheet stops producing profits? Because right now there's $9 trillion on there. Let's say it stays at $9 trillion, that's the cap. But because of inflation, let's say hypothetically, their costs were to skyrocket. And then suddenly, let's also say that because of calamity in the financial markets, U.S. government default, mortgage-backed securities defaulting, whatever, let's say that even though there's $9 trillion here, let's say the profits that it's producing start to plummet because of defaults. So this is all debt, right? So what if that debt stops getting repaid? Well, suddenly then, there are no more profits at the Federal Reserve. They lose money. Now, just like in the prior example of banks that had bank runs, this should result in bankruptcy. The Federal Reserve is supposed to operate as a bank for banks. They're not supposed to be a money printer for the government. This should result in a big fat bankruptcy and going out of business for the Federal Reserve. Legally, that's what's supposed to happen. If you take a look here, though, Mises.org, from Mises Wire, this article on Federal Reserve ignoring the rule of law, which they do. They ignore the rule of law. We've already covered that. They monetize the U.S. government debt. They print money to give to the Treasury to buy assets through their special purpose vehicles that are not legally allowed to be held on their balance sheet. They do a lot of shady stuff. It looks like in 2011, there are innovations in accounting policies that would allow them to transfer indirectly through inflation any losses. They would be able to monetize the Federal Reserve losses. So instead of the Fed just creating new dollars in order to purchase assets or lend out to people, instead what the Federal Reserve would do is create dollars to make up the shortfall from their losses. And so this is where the Federal Reserve would take one more step there. Let's say they have, $1 billion worth of expenses, and let's say their balance sheet today is making them $100 billion a year. So they give $99 billion back to the government. Well, in the future, if their expenses are, let's say, $2 billion from inflation, but the balance sheet stops producing profits in excess of $2 billion, let's say it only produces $1 million, they've got a $2 billion loss. All they would do at that point is print the extra dollars necessary to pay their employees to fund their expenses. What would this do to the economy? Well, we know that money isn't wealth, right? Money measures wealth. So if we look at a chart, we've got money over here, and we've got all of the wealth, the goods and services over here. Now, those are, let's say, the same exact line. But if we double the supply of money in the system to where it looks like that, well, it still takes all of this money to buy all that wealth. So it just takes double the amount of money now to buy the same amount of wealth, because there was no change to the amount of wealth. There was only a change to the amount of money in the system. And so new money that comes into existence only has purchasing power as a percentage of the existing pool of money. So when new money is created, it extracts purchasing power away from all the existing money. So to the extent that the Federal Reserve has losses that they have to then monetize their own losses, they are transferring purchasing power away from the economy to themselves, literally stealing purchasing power from every US citizen to fund their expenses, which basically just means pay the paychecks of all the failed PhDs that they have on payroll. They're contributing nothing to society. In fact, they're actively withdrawing wealth, withdrawing purchasing power from society. They're protected from the business cycle. They're protected from the consequences of their own decisions, and they are forcing the consequences of those decisions even more so on every single other American, confiscating the wealth and purchasing power of the economy for their own benefit. And in fact, anything that new money is created for, whenever you have new money come into existence, anytime that happens, you are confiscating wealth. It's a wealth transfer because they're siphoning purchasing power away from the existing pool of money and giving it to wherever those new dollars go. And so despite the fact that it looks like a bailout is helpful to some people during some times, it always results in a wealth transfer that is by definition more destructive than the alternative of just doing nothing. And if you want more information about this, I highly recommend the book Fed Up by Danielle DiMartino Booth. It's a fantastic book. She used to work at the Fed. She gives you an inside picture of what it looks like to work there. Number one, their flawed models. Number two, their lackadaisical attitude about work. They're government employees. They're not free market employees. Many of them have never worked a day in their life in the free market outside of just their laser focused tunnel vision inside the Federal Reserve. They have no idea what the real world is like, what the economy is really like. They look at backwards looking data through flawed models, making decisions that impact the lives of everyday Americans, and they have no idea what it means to be an everyday American. So I highly recommend that book. Hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments section below. And as always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.